Students, today we're going to be looking at square roots. And I know some of you have seen this little symbol and wondering what in the world this is, so we're going to explain everything that you need to know about square roots. So, first of all, what does it look like? It looks like a division symbol with a little V in the front. Okay? That is called a radical. Oh, and by the way, whatever I'm writing on this paper, you're going to write on your paper as well. It can also be called a square root, or it can just be called a root. Okay? The radical is the name of the sign, the square root is what it's doing, and a root is what you find when you use that symbol. So that's what you're going to find. You might find something that says the square root of 25, or the square root of 7, or something like that. Okay? Now, what does it actually mean? It means that I'm the square root, I'm going to put square root. Whoops, I forgot the word root. Square root is a number you multiply by itself So, for instance, the square root of 25. What number can I multiply by itself to get to 25? Exactly, 5. The square root of 25 is 5. What about the square root of 49? What number can I multiply by itself to get to 49? Well, that would be 7. 7 times 7 is 49, so the square root is 7. Now there are some numbers, for instance, like the square root of 7, that you have to use a calculator for because it isn't what we call a perfect square, or the square root is not a whole number. Okay? So you might have to use a calculator and you get some crazy decimal. I'm not going to worry about those right now because we're not worried about those right now. We'll use a calculator for those later. Okay? But that's what it means. The square root of a number is a number that you multiply by itself to get to that number. Okay? Now, there's this thing about a positive and a negative. I'm going to go back to the square root of 25 thing. I know that 5 times 5 is 25, but isn't negative 5 times negative 5 also 25? It is. So actually every square root has two answers. The positive answer and the negative answer. So the square root of 25 is actually 5 and negative 5. We have a new symbol that I'm going to introduce that helps us know that, and that is the plus or minus symbol. So instead of putting 5 and negative 5, I can just put plus or minus 5, and that gives me the square root. Now typically I don't use the negative version of the square root in real world problems and things. Most of the time when we're doing a real world problem, it's just going to be the positive answer. But you have to know, if I just give you the square root of 81, I can't just put 9, I might have to put plus or minus. So let's look at a visual meaning of a square root. So I want to draw a square that is 1 by 1. Okay? Just a square. Okay? What is the area of that square? It's 1. Okay, so I know the area is 1. I'm going to write it over on this side because I can't write inside. Well, what's the square root of 1? To find the square root of 1, I just count the length of the side. What times itself equals 1? And that's 1. So the square root of 1 equals 1. What about the square root? Let's draw another square. And we're going to draw a 2 by 2. And the area is 4. So what is the square root of 4? Well, what times itself equals 4? And that would be 2. So if I look at a square and I'm given the area of a square, all I have to do is find the square root of that area to find the length of one side. Let's do a 3 by 3. And the area is 9. So if I wanted to find the square root of 9, or the length of one side, I would count the lengths as one side, and that would equal to 3. Now, why am I not using a negative on any of these numbers? You're right, because you cannot have a negative length of something. If I'm looking at the length of something, it can't be a negative number. It's just going to be positive. So let's draw a 4 by 4. And the area of that 4 by 4 is going to be 16. And so the square root of 16 is 4. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different on this one right here. I'm going to draw 5 by 5, and I'm going to draw it right next to the 4. Okay? Because here's a way I want you to visualize it. Let's pretend that this 5 by 5 right here is a flower pot. And so I'm going to draw a flower. I guess I need green for the stem. I'm going to draw a flower coming out of this pot. Oh, isn't that a beautiful flower so far? Man, it is gorgeous. Look at that beautiful flower coming out of that flower pot. Wow, exciting. And now I want to draw the root, because you know we have to have a root for a flower. So I'm going to draw a root that goes all the way down to the bottom. Now visualize this. I've got a flower, and we're going to say that this square is the pot, and I've got a root that goes all the way down to the bottom. Well, how long is that root in this pot that has an area of 25? That root is 5 units long, so the square root of 25 is 5. So maybe that picture of the flower pot will help you figure out that to find the square root, when I know the area, then I can just, what is the length of that root that goes all the way down to the bottom of the pot? Kind of fun. The last one we're going to do is a 6 by 6. So we'll come over here and do a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's the square root of 36. And we know it equals. Now, we're going to look at this how to find method 1. It says perfect square table, guess and check. Okay? So how do I find the square root? One is you just learn what your perfect squares are. So we're going to create a little table. We'll do the table in a minute. Okay? But let's start with the number 1. What is 1 squared? And squaring means multiplying by itself. What's 1 times 1? 1 times 1 is 1. So the first perfect square number is 1. What's 2 squared? 2 squared is 4. So the second perfect square number is 4. 3 squared is 9. 4 squared is 16. 5 squared is 25. 6 squared is 36. 7 squared is 49. 8 squared is 64. 9 squared is 81. 10 squared is 100. 11 squared is 121. 12 squared is 144. 13 squared is 169. And we're going to stop there. Now, why do you need to know this? What you need to understand is that all of these numbers in the bottom are called perfect squares. They are perfect squares because their square root is a whole number. So the square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 49 is 7. And that's one way to help you figure out what the square roots of numbers are, is just by memorizing these perfect squares and being able to count by perfect squares. 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, and keep going up to 13. Okay? That is, again, called a perfect square, and you're going to see that pretty often. Now, how to find number 2 is really easy. Cross out that word prime factorization, and we're just going to put calculator. Because any other time we need to find a square root, all we're going to do is use our calculator. So, now we're going to turn over our notes page and look at the back, and we're going to look at something. We're not doing this whole page. There's just a couple of things on here that we need to know how to do. And the first one is to find a square root of a fraction. Okay? So, what we're going to do is the how-to is find the square root of the numerator, then find the square root of the denominator. Okay? So if I have the square root of 81 over 4, I can separate that into the square root of 81 over the square root of 4. And I know that the square root of 81 by looking at my perfect squares chart is 9, and the square root of 4 is 2, and so that is what the square root of 81 over 4 is. Now we've got the square root of negative 80 over negative 5. One thing that you need to know is that you cannot find the square root of a negative number, so this answer is no solution, because it's not possible to find the square root of a negative number, because there's nothing that you multiply by itself that equals negative, because positive times positive is positive and negative times negative is positive, so there's no solution to that one. And then I have the square root of 625 over 100, and so I'm going to split this into the square root of 625 over the square root of 100. And I'll probably have to use my calculator for the square root of 625, but it is a perfect square, and that number is 25. And I know that if I look at my perfect squares chart, the square root of 100 is 10. So the square root of 625 over 100 is 25 over 10. For this next part, we're going to find the square root of decimal, how to, calculator. And if we're simplifying expressions, how to, calculator. So that's all that we're going to put for those two. And I'm going to come down here to this very last part, and there's some skills that we need to make sure that we understand how to do. The first one says find the length when given the area of a circle or a square. Okay? So the how-to is to set up an equation and solve. So if I know that the area is 100, just like we did with those flower pots, then to find the length of one side, I say that the area of a square equals s squared. The area is 100, and that equals s squared. So if I know that the s squared equals 100, the opposite of squaring a number is to find the square root. So I'm going to find the square root of both sides. The square root of 100 is 10, and the square root of s squared is s. So the length of each side, s equals 10. We'll work a whole lot more on that together. If I'm given the area of a circle, remember that the area of a circle is pi r squared. And I know that the area is 169 pi equals pi r squared. There's a pi on both sides, so I can just cross it out, cancel it out, not just cross it out and get rid of it, I can cancel it out, and so I get 169 equals r squared. Well, just like in this previous problem, to find the solution I have to find the square root of both sides, because the opposite of squaring a number is the square root. So the square root of 169, if we look back at our perfect squares chart, is 13, and the square root of r squared is just plain r. So the radius of that circle is 13. And let's look at one more over here. If the area of a square is 25 over 64 meters squared, find the perimeter. Oh, this is a two-step problem. So the first thing I have to do is find the length of one side. So I know that the area equals s squared, because it's a square. The area is 25 over 64. So now I've got to find the length of one side by finding the square root of 25 over 64 and the square root of s squared. And you remember, when we have the square root of a fraction, just find the square root of the numerator and the denominator. And so that is 5/8 equals the length of one side. But it asks me for the perimeter. So I'm going to split this box in two. To find the perimeter of the square now, I know that each side is 5/8, so I know that the perimeter equals 4s for a square, side plus side plus side plus side. And so P equals 4 times 5/8. And P equals, 4 times 5/8 is the same thing as 4 over 1 times 5 over 8. I can cancel the 4 and the 8. The 4 becomes a 1, the 8 becomes a 2. So the perimeter equals 1 times 5 is 5, over 1 times 2 is 2, which equals 2.5. So perimeter of the square is 2.5. The length of each side is 5/8, and the area is 25 over 64. Now I know that was a quick process through there, but I promise we'll work on these together a lot more. And that is the end of this video.